Good morning, everyone. Good morning. We're going to take a few minutes to let everyone get logged on before we get started. Thank you for joining us today. It's good to see everybody this morning. Welcome, welcome. Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Egypt Lloyd, and along with the Lloyd family, we established the Slave Legacy History Coalition in 2021 to provide an easier access to information and resources on the legacy of slavery before and after emancipation of the families of slave descendants and the general public. If you are joining us today for the first time, we encourage you to put your name and information in the chat so we can thank you for joining us today. We are very excited about our presenter today, Ms. Rachel Hoyle, who I will introduce in just a few minutes. But before that, I would like to turn it over to Naomi Gordon, who will give our announcements for today. Naomi?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Excuse my voice, I'm getting over a cold, so bear with me. So last month, we had Emily Javault present on her exhibit, Unnamed Figures in New York City, and I just want to make you guys aware that there's an accompanying book, and we do have a link to that book in our newsletter. And then I'd like to just briefly go over next year's presenter schedule. So in January, we have Catherine Matthews, Director of Education at Old North Illuminated. And in March, we have our first ever hybrid event, which I'll say a little bit more about in a moment. And then in April, we have Paula Bagger, who I believe is in the call from the Hingham Historical Society. So for the March event, we are partnering with the Massachusetts Historical Society to offer a hybrid event, so both in person and on Zoom as usual. We do plan to provide round-trip transportation from Harvard Square to Mass Historical for a small fee of $20. We just ask if people are interested in that event. There will be a short survey going out right after this meeting, just so we can get an initial head count and get our logistics in order. So if you're at all interested, do look out for that survey. Just note that is not the official registration for that event. That will be going out at a later time. And if you have any questions about that, just email us. I will drop our email in the chat. So I will turn it back over to Egypt to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Naomi. And I would like to inform everybody that after our presenter concludes her presentation, we will open up the floor for a Q&A if you could enter your questions in the chat. So today we are honored to have Rachel Hoyle. She is the program coordinator at the Shirley-Eustis House. Rachel is she plans events such as community festivals, and she also does academic lectures and concerts and more. She also gives daily tours of this state and works to deepen the community partnerships with other nonprofit and educational institutions in Roxbury and Dorchester. So thank you, Rachel, for your time today, and we're looking forward to your presentation, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Egypt and Naomi. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, just want to make sure before I get going. So I'm gonna share my screen, and like Egypt said, I'm going to give a presentation and then take questions at the end. But if you have a question that comes to your mind during the presentation, feel free to go ahead and drop it in the chat, because I know sometimes we have a question and then by the time the presentation finishes, you're like, man, I can't remember it. So feel free to go ahead and toss it in there. So let's see, I'll share my screen. All right, can everyone see that?
Mhm.
Great. Okay, so like Egypt said, my name is Rachel Hoyle. I'm the programs coordinator at the Shirley-Eustis House Association. And I want to thank everyone for being here today, and especially Egypt, Dennis, and Naomi for inviting me to speak. We're currently we're currently fighting what our board president terms a war on invisibility, which I think is the case with a lot of historic sites, or smaller historic sites, I should say. So I'm really grateful to have this opportunity this morning. So the Shirley-Eustis House, and what you can see here is the mansion of the Shirley-Eustis House, was built in 1747 by Royal Governor of Massachusetts Colony, William Shirley. And the house has a 300-year history that includes connections to, of course, colonial history, the early American Republic, actually a home for unwed mothers, Victorian tenement housing, and even the Haitian Revolution. We have some ties to that as well. And obviously, you know, I'm not talking about all of that today, but I just wanted to drop that as, if you ever want to come visit us in person, we'd love to have any and all of you. And we'll get into more of that history on our tours. So in terms of the history of our organization, in 1911, this mansion was purchased and preserved from demolition by the Shirley-Eustis House Association, which still owns it today. And we're a private organization. We're not connected to state or federal governments, but we weren't open regularly to the public until the late 1970s or early 1980s. Which is when the mansion was restored to its circa 1825 appearance. And from 1980 to about 2020, the site was interpreted kind of how you'd imagine when you hear New England Historic House. That involved really putting at the forefront the stories of the two governors who occupied the home. So William Shirley and then later William Eustis during the federal period. And naturally, that led a lot of our board and staff, as well as the community, to wonder what histories were being left out of that, what some people term that great white man history. So beyond just the governors themselves, clearly there were other people living and working in the house. So this very unassuming house is a property that we actually just acquired in July, I believe. It sits right across the street from our mansion at 4244 Shirley Street. So in 2019, there were obviously some very important global events going on, but at the Shirley-Eustis House, this was an event that was, you know, foundational to our mission and our purpose going forward, was that this house at 4244 Shirley Street went up for sale. And it was purchased by a developer who intended to tear it down and build new luxury condos, because what else is new in Boston? So to our staff and board and our neighbors at that point, you know, the news was, we didn't really want that to happen, but there was not much we could do about it. And we really were just, you know, we were kind of like, oh, this is bad, but, you know, that it is what it is. Until our neighbors on Shirley Street came forward with a rumor that had circulated for quite some time that this building actually used to be a slave quarters. And given that it was slated to be demolished, we figured we had better give that history a fair shake and see if there was any truth to that before the building was gone forever. And we found out quickly, as you can see from this image, that there was more in this building than meets the eye. You know, from its, let's see if I can go back on my presentation. Sorry, it looks like my computer screen is frozen. Here we go. All right, are you seeing that again? Okay, so we found out quickly that what looks like a modern building here, there were some bones within it, these studs and diagonal braces, as well as some plaster and lathe that dated back to the 18th century. And actually prior to this, on the Macris database, which is, as many of you know, the Massachusetts database for historic properties, this building was actually listed as being constructed in 1867 rather than the 18th century. So this already is upending the history we thought we knew about this property. And our architectural historians who entered the building before we owned it confirmed that its framing was 18th century, which meant that there was additional credence to the theory that this was a part of the Shirley estate and possibly a slave quarters. So this kind of left us reeling. Like previously, as I said, this news of a developer tearing it down wasn't great, but there wasn't much we could do about it. And now we knew there was something we had to do about it. And we had a very specific timeline for when that needed to occur. So clearly there was some history, we didn't know what it was, that wasn't being told in this structure. So we needed to conduct a lot of research very quickly. That was our step one, because we needed to figure out what this was. So to give you some context on kind of where we started in this research process, this was when I started at the Shirley-Eustis House as a volunteer giving tours in 2021, I believe. This was our 18th century rundown, basically. This is what we were presenting as part of our public tours. And this is just the bones. Clearly there's more than this, but this was the outline. So William Shirley, Royal Governor of Massachusetts Colony, built Shirley Place in 1747. This is Governor Shirley to the right. Roxbury at that time was farmland that the English colonists used for their estates. Going unsaid there was that there were enslaved laborers who worked on that farmland and in those households. Shirley's governance of Massachusetts Colony was marked by the 7 Years' War. We talked a lot about his military exploits and not as much about his personal life or about the workings of his household. And we talked about, Shirley's success or failure as a governor and politically. In 1770, Shirley passes away and the estate goes to his daughter and son-in-law, Elizabeth and Eliakim Hutchinson. They're going to come up again in my presentation, so I just wanted to introduce them here. Then in 1775, the Hutchinsons flee to England and essentially relinquish control of the estate. And then the Continental Army takes it over during the Revolutionary War. So this was our starting point. And you can see on the topic of enslavement at Shirley Place, we're essentially starting from zero. And again, we're on a timeline with this research too. So we're trying to find out as much as possible before the building gets demolished. So we commissioned a Harvard doctoral candidate, Abed Ali Bai, who has also since done studies at the Unitarian Universalist Urban Ministry in Roxbury. And he researched the history of slavery at Shirley Place and produced a preliminary report on the history of enslavement at our site. And our goal was to figure out definitively whether 4244 Shirley had a role in the history of enslavement at our site, as well as to learn who was enslaved by the Shirley family, because at that point we did not know their names, we did not know their identities. We didn't know if it was even possible to find that information, but it had never been attempted, so we knew we had to try. The city of Boston told us to apply for a city landmark designation. We were in touch with them about the destruction of this building. If it was a slave quarters, that would have made it the first slave quarters, the only slave quarters in the city limits of Boston. The Royal House and Slave Quarters is a super important site, and they've done amazing work on, using their slave quarters, but they're not in the city of Boston. So the city of Boston was really interested in our, the potential for what was there and the history we could discuss with it. So actually, this is a bit of a red tape thing, but we had never been approved as a Boston City landmark prior to this, which actually made us eligible to apply. And in the city landmark process, you can apply with buildings that you don't own, which we did in this case. We applied using the information that Abed found for us. We applied for a city landmark designation that would cover not only our mansion at 33 Shirley Street and our carriage house, but also 4244 Shirley Street, which we didn't own, but we could save from demolition. And in Abed's report, which you can find on our website, these are the people he identified as being enslaved at Shirley Place. So they are Jack, Jane, Thomas Scipio Sr., Thomas Scipio Jr., Caesar Sr., Caesar Jr., Affy, and Nanny. The probability that these people lived on the Shirley estate at some point of their enslavement is incredibly high, and for some of them, we know it to be a fact. So Abed, along with the Boston City archaeologist Joe Bagley, also discovered the original purpose of 4244 Shirley Street, which was as a fine Georgian stable for the governor's horses. And you can see it here on a map from 1775. So you have not only the Shirley mansion, but also several outbuildings on the Shirley estate as well. And then again, on this map from the 1850s too, you can see it labels the mansion as well as the stable. Now, note on this map that the shape of the house looks quite a bit different. Abed and Joe Bagley also found that 4244 Shirley Street is actually only half of this stable. So it is, they think, the right half of this long Georgian stable. So here I've included some images of an English estate from circa 1690. And then on the left is the accompanying stable with that estate. So that gives you an idea of what 4244 Shirley Street would have looked like in its day. Now, the stable at that time would have been used to house the governor's horses. And we know Governor Shirley had a collection of very fine horses that he actually would send to England to train them. At one point, he purchased a horse out from under Peter Faneuil, who wanted the horse very desperately, and Shirley, being the governor, could just buy it instead. But that does not mean that this was, it's a little black or white to say this was a slave quarters, this wasn't a slave quarters. And instead, what we found is that since this building is a Georgian stable, what that meant is that the enslaved men who cared for those horses and who worked in the household as footmen and coachmen would have lived in that building. And so I mentioned we found plaster, 18th century plaster in 4244 Shirley. That indicates a presence of someone living there at that time. And then I mentioned footmen. You can see here an image of footmen carrying a sedan chair from Brazil in the 1770s. So we don't think Governor Shirley would have traveled by sedan chair very often, but this gives you an idea of the livery that these men may have dressed in. And then here you can see a more detailed image of what the quote unquote bones of the building once looked like versus what remains today. So this image is courtesy of some architectural historians on our board. Half of it is still standing. The red portion is what is still standing today. And actually the reason we discovered that it was once twice as large as it is today, it was 80 feet instead of 40 feet, is that we found these numbered beams in the rafters, that started at 6, 7, and 8. And so we knew that they wouldn't have just started these beams at 6, 7, and 8. They would have started them at 1. And we believe at this point that the other half of 4244 Shirley Street was removed in 1867 and developed as its own residential home, and then at some point was demolished before today. And this 1867 date is significant because that's when Shirley Street was developed into a residential area. So it went from being farmland to being purchased by developers who then turned it into apartments as well as tenements. So the same man who developed the mansion at 33 Shirley Street into Victorian apartments also turned this stable into a residential home in 1867. And we think that much like today, it's cheaper to reuse a building and gut it and refinish it than it is to build one from scratch. We think that's why that developer in 1867 chose to reuse the mansion and the stable rather than just demolish them. Let's see, here we go. So this history that we found out about the stable and about the enslaved people who lived in it escalated the threat of demolition pretty much by infinity. I mean, we knew then that we needed to get this landmark designation or this building was going to be torn down. And we didn't know exactly what we wanted to do with 4244 Shirley at that point. We just knew that we needed to save it. So we submitted that landmark designation, and actually it was one of the quickest approved landmark designations in Boston's history. And in the fall of 2021, we did receive landmark designation for Shirley Place, including this building. And then in this year, 2023, we actually were able to purchase the building. So in July, we closed on the purchase of 4244. And thanks to a grant from the Boston Community Preservation Commission. And so now we own the building. The question becomes, what do we do with it? You know, we've owned it for about 6 months now, and we're into the process of figuring out how to best interpret this building and to adjust our mission as a historic site such that this is not just an addition to our property, but becomes a part of the story of our property.
Hi, I'm Faustina.
And so now what I'm going to do is talk about the stories of the people who were enslaved at this site, or what we know as of right now, and give you an idea of kind of what we talk about interpretively. We've adjusted our tour actually to include these stories as much as possible. But moving forward, our hope is to incorporate exhibit space as well as, you know, we're starting a master planning process to retool how we think about the role of enslavement at our site. So again, the first step is to talk about the names and the identities of the people who were enslaved at Shirley Place. And we have varying degrees of knowledge for each individual, as you'll see, and as I'm sure many of you are aware if you've conducted research on enslavement. The records are just all over the place in terms of what's there and what's missing from the historical record. Sorry, my slideshow is slow, so I'm making sure that it changes before I start. So first we have Jack. He's the first person we know to have been enslaved by Governor Shirley while Shirley was in the colonies. And we're unsure whether he was still, you can see this advertisement is from 1732. We're unsure whether he was still enslaved when Shirley built Shirley Place, but we're erring on the side of saying most likely, and including him in our interpretation. All we know about Jack is contained in this one runaway ad that was in the Boston newsletter in 1732. But we do get a lot of information from it. Jack is described as a mulatto Negro boy, about 19 years of age, of a middle stature, his head close shaved with 3 or 4 little scars under the corner of one of his eyes. The ad then goes on to talk about what he was wearing when he emancipated himself and where he might be going. So it talks about where he was enslaved prior to being enslaved by Mr. Shirley in Boston. And then it says that whoever brings him back to Governor Shirley will receive 20 shillings for his trouble, which is a direct quote. We currently don't know whether Jack was ever caught. Many runaway slaves were, and it's kind of haunting to think about what might have happened to Jack if he was caught. And actually, in my mind, and this is just conjecture, but it's a good sign to me that we never hear anything else about Jack, at least in the Shirley records, because that means that he didn't show up again in probate records or in any baptisms or burial records that we have. Now, while Jack may not have lived at Shirley Place, although he may have, Thomas Scipio, who's our next individual, certainly did live at Shirley Place. He was Governor Shirley's enslaved valet, so we know the most about him of anyone who was enslaved at Shirley Place. So born around 1700, he would have been about the same age as Governor Shirley. In 1736, this runaway ad was posted, which shows us that Scipio was not yet enslaved by Governor Shirley in 1736, but we know that he was by about 1749. So somewhere in there is when he was perhaps sold to Governor Shirley. And we do know that the woman in this ad went to King's Chapel regularly with Governor Shirley. So it's possible that was the means through which the two of them knew each other. We know that Thomas Scipio accompanied Shirley on a trip to England between his 2 terms as governor. So this would have been around 1749. And in Thomas Scipio's role as a personal valet, he would have slept on a cot or even on the floor in Shirley's bedroom and accompanied Shirley pretty much everywhere. I find it interesting that he accompanied Shirley on a trip across the Atlantic. And in this ad, it describes Scipio as having been used to the sea. So unlike in the ad for Jack, they actually say in this ad that people are forbidden from aiding him or carrying him off to the sea, which I assume they did because he was at one point a sailor or worked on sailboats. Now, Thomas Scipio was Shirley's personal valet. So I've included here an image of George Washington and his valet, William Lee, whose position in the Washington household would have been very similar to that Thomas Scipio occupied in the Shirley household. Now, William Shirley dies in 1770, and with that, Thomas Scipio's ownership passed to Elizabeth Shirley Hutchinson, his eldest daughter, and her husband Eliakim, both of whom I mentioned earlier. In 1775, the Hutchinson family fled to England at the outbreak of the American Revolution and left Thomas Scipio as head of Shirley Place for about 9 months. So they abandoned him in Boston despite fearing for their own safety and also made him responsible for protecting the estate, presumably on his own or with the other enslaved people who were left there. About 9 months after that, the Continental Army commandeered Shirley Place and used it as a local headquarters or housing or a hospital during the siege of Boston. And you can see Thomas Scipio listed here as being transferred to, his ownership was transferred to Elizabeth Shirley Hutchinson when Eliakim died in 1775. And then in 1784, Elizabeth Shirley Hutchinson actually lists him as a reference when she applies for compensation due to property loss during the American Revolution. So she's applying to the British government to be compensated for loss of Shirley Place. And her reference is a man she's enslaving, Thomas Scipio. So now she treats him like a person because she stands to gain something from that. And then to thank him for his years of service, the Hutchinsons sell Thomas Scipio to a man in Ludlow, England. And notice Thomas Scipio was born in America, and then presumably at the end of his life, he would have been in his early 80s, was sent to the UK. Now, this is where the records get murky, because for this reason, we're unsure whether this was the same Thomas Scipio who is now being sent to the UK to be enslaved by a new household, because at that point he would have been fairly old, especially for an enslaved person. So unless he had a very particular skill that made him particularly valuable, we actually think that there may have been a Thomas Scipio Jr. Who was the one sold to someone in the UK. But regardless of whether it was a senior or a junior, after this point, we lose track of Thomas Scipio. And we can only hope that if he lived long enough, he did experience emancipation when slavery was outlawed in England soon after this. Next, we have Caesar. Now, we know nothing about Caesar beyond his existence in Elizabeth Brinley Hutchinson's 1765 will. And it's a bit confusing because I said Elizabeth Brinley Hutchinson. This is Eliakim Hutchinson's mother. She had enslaved Caesar, and upon her death in 1765, Caesar then is enslaved by her son, Eliakim, the husband of Elizabeth Shirley Hutchinson. And at this point, the Hutchinsons were actually the owners of Shirley Place. So in 1765, Governor Shirley was still, or former Governor Shirley was still living there, but he had already transferred ownership to his daughter and son-in-law. So at that point, we can presume Caesar was working at Shirley Place. Now, whereas Thomas Scipio was Shirley's valet and thus likely would have lived in the house, in the mansion, it's possible that Caesar was one of the men who worked and lived in the stable. So I have here an image from 1667, which is titled "A Turk Led by a Negro Stable Boy in Livery." And this gives you an idea of what would have been happening at this fine stable at 4244 Shirley Street. So it's possible that Caesar's life would have looked something like this, albeit not as nice as it does in this painting. Now, while Caesar might have been caring for the horses, there were other roles in which enslaved men would have lived in the stable at 4244 Shirley. One of those is working as a footman in the household, and this is a portrait of Baron von Nagel's running footman. So footmen would have been dressed in livery similar to this. The Shirley family's colors were blue and gold, so just imagine that this red is gold. And that may have been what their livery looks like. Footmen literally would have run alongside the carriage containing Governor Shirley as it drove from Roxbury to Boston or vice versa. So they literally would have run alongside it shouting, "The governor's coming, the governor's coming." And that was what they did. Now, one of the women we know was enslaved at Shirley Place was named Jane. And we have a record of her here, again, in Elizabeth Shirley's, I believe this is Elizabeth Shirley's petition to the government for loss of property. It's likely that Jane was either a laundress or a cook. And there certainly would have been more enslaved women at Shirley Place because they likely would have had a full kitchen staff as well as at least one laundress. And unfortunately, we have not found records of those women yet. We did find one record of a woman Shirley enslaved while he lived in the Bahamas, and her name was Cleo. But that's all we know about her so far. Now, we do know that Jane had, as it mentions here, 2 children. And Jane's children's names were Affy and Caesar Jr., as we call him. And then there was a 3rd infant enslaved at Shirley Place called Nanny. And this aspect of our interpretation is the one that always gets under my skin the most, talking about enslaved children, especially because of the way enslaved children were treated in white households at that time. Jeremy Belknap, who founded the Massachusetts Historical Society, is quoted as saying, enslaved children were often given away like puppies at that time. And we can see a level of that in the way that enslaved people were named by their enslavers. You see a lot of Roman and Greek mythology names, which almost seems like cruel in the way that they, not only took away enslaved people's identities by naming them themselves and not letting them use a traditional name, but also in, using some sort of mythology, storytelling, or mythological names. Now, Nanny was likely given to the Hutchinsons, who enslaved her, as a gift. Enslaved children and infants were a sign of wealth because enslaved child or infant in your household, that is an enslaved person who is not able to work. And in fact, they required care, usually from another enslaved person, usually a woman. And so not only were they an economic liability, which is why they were given away so freely, but they were a sign of wealth because that meant you had the wealth to spare to pay for their food and lodging and care while they weren't bringing you a profit. So this is an image, and you see this a lot in portraiture of the time. You see enslaved children and infants used as like signs of wealth. So here you have an enslaved child who's dressed very well, who still is in service to the Duchess of Portsmouth in this case. So Nanny, who I mentioned being given as a gift to the Shirley household, was enslaved by one of Governor Shirley's children. And we have a record of her being baptized at King's Chapel when she was 18 months old. And then 4 days later, we have a record of her being buried at King's Chapel. Here's another portrait of an enslaved child to the right there. I believe that's a boy. And this is a portrait of Elihu Yale. So of Yale University fame. A really famous example of this is Phyllis Wheatley. Now, while Phyllis Wheatley did enjoy many more freedoms and a lot more fame than many enslaved people of that period, public opinion of her was still really tainted. She wasn't considered a poet in her own right because she was an enslaved child raised by a white family. And so that's the same sort of thing we see here with Nanny and possibly Affy and Caesar Jr. happening in the Shirley household. So these are the people we know of who were enslaved at Shirley Place and the roles they played in the Shirley household. To be clear, these again are not all of the people enslaved here, most likely. We're still actively researching and actually seeking some academic partnerships with universities as a way to move forward and continue our research. So this presentation may look very different in several months, several years, 10 years, and we may have, hopefully we'll have a lot more information to speak of. Now, in terms of moving forward interpretively, which is what I started this presentation with, you know, knowing what we know and now owning 4244 Shirley Street, again, the question becomes, what do we do with this? And how do we do it right? And so to that end, we're starting a master planning process currently, actually. I think we just had our first meeting. And we have a neighborhood advisory committee. So we have many folks who are native to Roxbury and Dorchester on the committee. And really we're asking them, what obligation do we have to our community to share this history? And also there's an element of how do we make Roxbury's history Boston's history? Because it is fundamentally, you know, the Tea Party and the Freedom Trail and all that were in downtown Boston. But in the summer, you had a whole world happening out here in Roxbury that was a world of class stratification, of chattel slavery, and of racism. And so we don't want that history to go underrepresented any longer, at least, you know, as much as we can help it. And again, to that end, so about a year ago, we had the Boston City archaeology team came and did a dig at 4244 Shirley Street. So you can see there's quite a large front yard to 4244. And actually, there's a lot more in the dirt than there is through much of Shirley Street. This is some of the only original undisturbed soil on Shirley Street. So actually there was also a dig in the front yard of the backyard of the Shirley mansion that turned up nothing several years ago. I think that was in 2018. But this dig at 4244 found this original paved walkway and also uncovered what we believe to be some of the foundations of Shirley Place. And the archaeology team actually stopped after a certain point because, excuse me, while they think there was some evidence of the kitchen. So I should back up a little, the current foundation of Shirley Place is actually the 1867 foundation. The original 18th century foundation is still in the yard at 4244 from before the neighborhood was developed and the mansion was moved. And so not only is 4244 significant as a building in its own right, but the archaeology on this land was also a reason we needed to save it. And so in the future, we'd like to do further archaeological digs, but we want input from African-American folks in the neighborhood because this is their history. It's all of our history, but we want to be respectful, especially if there are artifacts there of people who could be their ancestors. And so again, like I said, moving forward, our goal is to interpret this history and put it on display, which is something that is, we think, sorely lacking in Boston until very recently. Now, organizations like this one make it possible for us to network and connect and partner with other historical sites and other groups that are trying to do the same thing. So we're really grateful for that. And let's see. Oh, on our website. So actually the reason I first got involved with the Shirley-Eustis House was as a graduate student at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And so we do have on our website a web exhibit on the history of slavery at the Shirley-Eustis House. So that's one of the ways we're trying to work in the interim before we can actually interpret 4244 Shirley as a full exhibit space. But right now we have started what we call the 4244 Shirley Street project. And so what we're doing is trying to raise the funds to not only complete the purchase of 4244 Shirley Street, which, like I mentioned, we received a grant from the CPC that will cover half the cost. But unfortunately, the developer who purchased it wanted to make a profit on the building. And so we had to pay actually about double the assessed price of the building. So our goal is to complete that purchase and then to, like I said, turn 4244 Shirley into a modern exhibit space, where we will then discuss the history of slavery and of colonization in all its forms in New England, as well as the impact of the British Empire on our modern world today, because it's still affecting modern class division, modern racism, and many other aspects of our society. So with that, I think I'm just about at time. So now we will switch over to the Q&A, if that's all right with you, Egypt and Dennis and Naomi.
Yes, absolutely. So now I encourage everyone to enter your questions in the chat for Miss Rachel. Rachel, that was a fascinating presentation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, of course.
So the chat, are you going to read the questions in the chat, Egypt?
Yeah, I'm going through them now. So from Sarah Burks, I wonder if the other half of the stable is still in the neighborhood somewhere. It probably wasn't moved far away. It wasn't, actually. We think that it sat for a time in the yard of what the land we now own as part of the Shirley-Eustis House Association. We think we found it in images from the early 20th century, I believe, but at some point it disappears and no longer appears in images. So we think it was demolished. If we found it, of course, we would do everything in our power to purchase it. Whether or not we could move it back, I don't know, because there's already so much happening on the side of 4244 Shirley. I don't know if we'd have room for it. But on the off chance it wasn't demolished, that would be amazing. But unfortunately, I don't think that's the case. And then Paula Paris asked, was Scipio a surname or other identifier? Do you know anything about the name? Yes, so Scipio actually is one of those Roman names. So Scipio was a statesman, I believe, in ancient Rome. Yeah, and our executive director, Susie, chimed in. Thanks, Susie. So she says, yes, Scipio is a common name for enslaved men. And in Thomas's case, he seems to have adopted it as a last name, or it was just assigned as his last name. Yes, and there are still families in Roxbury with the last name Scipio. So yes, Scipio Africanus, so a Roman general stationed in North Africa. And again, you can see this name is used a lot. It's just, yeah, it bothers me how it was such a diminutive way to assign names. Was Eliakim Hutchinson related to Governor Thomas Hutchinson? Yes, I'm not sure exactly how, but yes, like many of those early Boston names, they were all descended from someone who came over on the Mayflower and, that sort of thing. So any other questions, feel free to just chime in, folks, if you don't want to type it in the chat.
Hi, Rachel. This is Dennis Lloyd. Having grown up in Roxbury and born and raised, lived there all my life, uh, this is very, you know, very astonishing news. Not only here, hearing about slavery in Roxbury, but not only here, but also in the first church of Roxbury, the work that Byron Rushing and uh, Reverend Margaret's been doing up in that area, and along with Mr. Beebe. Uh, it is it's really eye-opening. Having grown up there, like I said, I never thought of slavery being a part of Roxbury. So this is a very good presentation, provides, some very good information. So thank you, Rachel. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Dennis. I'm glad to hear that I feel while I really want to uplift this history, it's great to hear that from someone who's a Roxbury native, since I'm not.
If I can chime in.
Of course, Dr. Ballinger, good to see you today.
Yes. Rachel, wonderful presentation. It's wonderful to see you again so soon. I just want to say that I would encourage everyone to find some time to visit the Shirley-Eustis House and actually see the work that's being done and to see the way in which they are memorializing the folks who they have identified as being enslaved there, and to give support to the Shirley-Eustis House. That's all I have to say.
Excellent.
Excellent. Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks,
Any
Dr.
last question for Miss Rachel? I do believe.
Yeah, I see a few in the chat there.
Yeah.
So Sarah Alger, I'm sorry if I'm butchering your last name, of the Russell Museum asks, is there a time limit that we're up against for raising the rest of the money for the purchase of the building? Not as urgent as saving 4244. However, and I'm not as privy to the financial side of things as Susie is. So Susie, if there is a time limit, feel free to add it to the chat. But it's more that first, our personal internal goal, I guess, is to have, our goal is to raise $5 million for the completion of the purchase, as well as the research that we'll need to undertake to properly interpret the building, and then to fully convert 4244 into a workable exhibit space. Now, our goal is to raise that by 2030, which we realize is particularly ambitious, but 2030 is the 400th, I believe, anniversary of Boston. And so we think it's vital that the anniversary of Boston isn't just confined to, again, the Tea Party, like Cotton Mather, the founding, the Puritans, but also includes these diverse histories, which again, we're not the only side doing this. I should also say this is a unique story and we're very proud of it, but we're not the only side in Boston making this history possible. So I do encourage you to check out other Boston sites like the Royal House, like History Cambridge, the Longfellow / Washington's headquarters site. We're all on this mission to make Boston's history more inclusive and more diverse. And Bailey Thaxton asks, may I ask how you and your team have approached engagement with the Roxbury community, and what organizations or institutions have you found receptive? That's a great question, actually, and that's a lot of what my role as programs coordinator has been. So we work a lot with Roxbury and Dorchester nonprofits, and we found, I would say 99% of them to be receptive to not only working with us, but to amplifying our mission and what we're trying to do. And in fact, it's interesting that not only are other historical organizations in Roxbury, so like Roxbury Historical Society, which Byron Rushing is really involved in, and the Dorchester Historical Society, as well as the Dillaway Thomas House, and Roxbury Heritage State Park, not only those historical organizations, but also other nonprofits and other completely different subjects. So like we work closely with the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, which is a housing cooperative, as well as Children's Services of Roxbury, which is a social services organization, and the Dudley Street Neighborhood Charter School, which is a charter school on our street. But all of these organizations have really been wonderful to work with and to partner with in different ways, whether that's, you know, just bringing them to our site. We do rentals of our space as well, and our preference for our rental, we rent to everyone, but our preference for our rentals is to local organizations, especially local nonprofits. And then John Galuzzo, hi John, how are you? Mentioned gaps. Rachel, you've mentioned gaps in the known history. Are there ways that volunteer researchers can support your work? Resources we can search to enhance your efforts? To that end, I would say if you're interested in researching this topic, or interested in learning more about us and you have the time, contact us. But on our website, which I can type in the chat, you can find contact information for myself as well as for Susie Buchanan, our executive director. We're the only two staff, so those are the only two emails that are on there. But feel free to email us if you have time and you'd like to offer your services as a researcher. There's a lot that needs to be done, especially, you know, we have this laundry list of research we'd like to do that would require us to travel. So a lot of it is seeking out fellowships as well. And, you know, students who actually have the time and can find the resources to travel. So for instance, we know we need to go to the UK and to find out more about Thomas Scipio, as well as to potentially find some more Shirley family papers. And then also the Bahamas. Governor Shirley was royal governor of the Bahamas for a time. And so we believe there may be records there as to, we know of at least two people he enslaved while governor of the Bahamas, Cleo and David. But we think a lot of those records are actually still in the Bahamas and perhaps not digitized. So, so thank you for that question, John. And then it looks like we're coming up on time. So maybe our last question from Debbie Weiss. Can you get some assistance from local and state government to obtain the property for a more reasonable price given its historic significance? Yes, it does seem egregious for the developer to be allowed to charge that much. Unfortunately, so we did work with the Community Preservation Commission and the CPA Act, and they're the ones who, they're only actually legally able to give us the appraisal amount of the property. So that's why they couldn't give us the full asking price. But yes, the developer did know that that was the case and still charged us twice the appraisal value. So, but we are looking into larger grant making opportunities. That's something Susie and I we call ourselves kind of the chief cook and bottle washer because there are two of us, so we do everything. So we're both pretty much constantly writing letters of inquiry to funders. So it's always there in the back of our minds.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rachel. Again, fascinating presentation. And we also like to thank everyone that joined us today for our last meeting for 2023. I want to remind everyone of our speakers in January. We have Catherine Matthews, the Director of Education at Old North Illuminated. And again, like as Naomi said earlier, we will be having a hybrid event at the Massachusetts Historical Society on March the 13th. And on April the 10th of 2024, we will have Paula Bagger from the Higham Historical Society. We want to thank everyone for joining us today. And if you want to get a recap of today's meeting or our past meetings of this year, we do have a YouTube channel where you can review our meetings that we have held this year. Dad, did you have a statement that you wanted to say before I dismiss everyone?
I did. First of all, I wanted to say thank you to everyone who's here, to all of our friends who have been with us all year and years past participating, and some new members. I see Paul there, and I see certainly Representative Byron Russian, who we certainly want to call upon to give a presentation. And maybe we might be able to work out something for February, being Black History Month. I mean, that might be a appropriate time. And given the fact that I do live right down the street on Kenilworth Street, part of the time of the year on from the First Church of Roxbury, so we own a place there. But for those of you who are not familiar overall with the mission of the Slave Legacy History Coalition, its purpose is to provide a platform for stories that have not been told and not been presented, primarily right now in the Boston, Cambridge area. But we obviously go beyond that. And because there are so many stories about enslaved people, free emancipation, but also the accomplishments of what happened and the challenges that were faced by free slaved after emancipation. So there are many sites, certainly like the Shirley-Eustis House. What we provide here at the Slave Legacy History Coalition is a monthly meeting where a platform is provided for those of you who have stories who are associated with institutions or have a family story that you think would be, appropriate and of interest to, our audience. And please let us know by putting that information in our chat. And also, we will not in the chat, but by contacting us at our website, which is Slave Legacy History Coalition. .org. And so we would welcome that information, and we would like to work with you so that everyone can hear these stories. So
and
again,
if you have any announcements too as well, or if you would like to be a presenter, feel free to email us at that email address.
So again, thank you very much, Egypt.
Thank you, Dad.
Anyone else? Do you want to close out by thanking everyone again?
Thank you, everyone. There's so many people here that I see. So good friends, Dr. Pearson, Cushion, Elizabeth. I don't want to miss anyone, but all of you guys here today, so many of you, Dr. Bellinger, Paula. But we look forward to seeing you in the new year, and I hope that you all have a good holiday season. And like I said, if you have any more questions for us, feel free to email us at info@slavelegacyhistorycoalition.org. And everyone, take care. Thank you for joining us today.
Ted, take care. Cushion, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Take care.